Hello friends, welcome to Life Prep. Today we'll check out a very interesting topic in breathing physiology, which is regulation of respiratory rhythm. So our topic for today is neuronal regulation of breathing, and we'll check out how the neuronal system plays a role in regulation of respiration and maintenance of the respiratory rhythm. Okay. So first of all, the main centers for regulation of respiration are mainly located in the brain stem. So I have drawn basically a section showing pons and medulla, right? So this superior section is obviously the pons, and this caudal section is definitely the medulla. Okay. So let me write here, in fact, for clarity, this one is pons and this one is medulla. Okay. And we can begin our discussion by saying that in this section of the brainstem, we have what is called as the respiratory centers. So respiratory centers are located in pons and in the medulla in this manner. Okay. And this respiratory center is further divided into several groups, or as we call them, respiratory groups. So I will show you the bigger picture and I'll make it more detailed. So first of all, the first group is located in the medulla oblongata, and in fact it has two segments. It has two respiratory groups. So one which is located in the dorsal side is the dorsal respiratory group. So I will write here DRG. DRG basically stands for the dorsal respiratory group. And the one which is slightly smaller and located towards the ventral part is what we call as aptly the VRG, or the ventral respiratory group. So there are two respiratory groups which are located in the medulla. In comparison, there is just one respiratory group which is located in the pons. So in the pons, we just have one respiratory group and we call it pontine respiratory group. So if you face up this question, that how many respiratory groups do we actually have for regulation of respiration in the respiratory center? So in our respiratory center, humans have three respiratory groups. The two respiratory groups, which are the VRG and DRG, ventral and dorsal respiratory groups, are located in the medulla, whereas the third respiratory group is located in the pons. In the pons, the pontine respiratory group is further divided into two centers. The superior center, or you can say the anterior center, is what we call as the pneumotaxic center. So within the PRG, within the pontine respiratory group, we have what is called as a pneumotaxic center. Pneumotaxic center. And we also have another inferior center, which means it lies below the pneumotaxic center. And this one is called as the apneustic center. Apneustic center. So if we look at the partitioning within the respiratory center is mainly located in the pontine medullary region in the brainstem. And the pontine respiratory group, we just have one single pontine respiratory group. So we have one respiratory group in the pons and we have two respiratory groups in the medulla. The dorsal and the ventral respiratory groups are bilaterally present in two regions, which means in the left and right bilateral regions of the brainstem. So we have two DRGs and two VRGs, left and right each. And same goes for the pontine respiratory group, but the pontine respiratory group is further divided into two more centers, which are the pneumotaxic center, and the inferior one is called the apneustic center. Okay. So this is what we call as the respiratory centers overall. And this respiratory center, its function is to maintain the pattern of breathing, the depth of breathing, the rate of breathing. Okay, so all of those things will be regulated by this respiratory center. So whenever we have such a regulation, we obviously have to bring input signals to the respiratory center. And then the respiratory center will, based upon its natural algorithm, will decide that whether or not to fire impulses to the nerves which supply to the muscles which are involved in regulation or the physical activity or the pulmonary ventilation. So the respiratory center will basically take inputs from various receptors and from various sources. So input signals will come to the respiratory center, whether it be VRG, DRG, or any other for that matter. So it has to receive certain inputs, and then it will, based upon its natural working principle, it will fire impulses to the nerves, which will supply to muscles which are involved in breathing regulation. And these respiratory groups, they basically also talk to each other, which means there can be axon running from pontine respiratory group to dorsal respiratory group. And remember, the pontine respiratory group is negative to the dorsal respiratory group, which means the pontine respiratory group, especially in the pneumotaxic center, it inhibits the activity of DRG. Whereas the apneustic center promotes the activity of DRG. The DRG usually promotes the activity of ventral respiratory group, or the VRG. First of all, let us see the individual roles of these respiratory groups. What actually happens is DRG supplies to external intercostals. It supplies to external intercostals, right? External intercostals, and also to diaphragm. So this is the output of DRG. That DRG sends signals to external intercostal muscles and to diaphragm. And we have learned in our previous sessions that external intercostal muscle as well as diaphragm, they are involved in inhalation, which means the DRG has to do with inhalation. Inhalation. And during the restful breathing period, which means when we are breathing normally, when we don't have to indulge into forceful breathing or any kind of impulsive breathing, in that case, the DRG is enough, because DRG is generating inhalation signals by activation of nerves which supply to external intercostals and diaphragm. And as we know that inhalation is a property, and then after inhalation, the exhalation is mostly because of elastic recoil of the lung. So we don't have anything which pulls back these muscles other than the elastic recoil of the lung. So inhalation is all you need, because exhalation is not totally neurally regulated. It is because of elastic regulation. So DRG sends positive signals to external intercostals and diaphragm muscles through obviously the nerves, and it causes inhalation. So you can remember that during restful breathing, DRG is all you need. You don't even need VRG. You don't also need much of pontine respiratory group. What about VRG? The VRG actually supplies to internal intercostal muscles. Supplies to internal intercostal muscles. Internal intercostal muscles. And also it does supply to accessory muscles. Now, when we talk about these muscles like accessory muscle and internal intercostal muscle, then you are talking about forced breathing. Okay? Then you are talking about forced breathing. So when we have restful breathing or quiet breathing, the breathing which we do inadvertently, during that case, all we need is the DRG. So DRG sends positive signals to external intercostals and diaphragm, and it helps in inhalation. The VRG, on the other hand, sends signals to accessory muscles, and this is involved in forced breathing. So during normal breathing, we don't even need DRG as much. And the DRG often triggers VRG, which means the normal inhalation rhythm is going to also affect the force system, because VRG does not receive direct inputs from other sources. It receives input from DRG. The VRG receives inputs from VRG, not generally from other sources. Then we can come and pay attention to the pontine respiratory group. We have two, within pontine respiratory group, we have two centers, the pneumotaxic and the apneustic. The pneumotaxic center can be called as the end of inspiration, because it creates an inspiratory off switch. It creates what is called as an inspiratory off switch. In short, we abbreviate it as IOS, inspiratory off switch. And the pneumotaxic center basically shuts down the activity of DRG, which means DRG initiates inhalation, and after a small period, when inhalation should be over, the signals from pneumotaxic center negatively affects DRG, and that causes end of the inspiratory cycle. So inspiratory cycle is initiated by the DRG and the pneumotaxic center is involved in ending of that inspiratory cycle. So inspiratory off switch or the IOS is what we call as the activity of pneumotaxic center rather. So pneumotaxic center is involved in ending of inspiratory rhythm, and inspiratory rhythm is normally regulated by DRG. There's one fact to the matter, and that fact to the matter is that the apneustic center positively controls DRG, which means it promotes inspiration, whereas the pneumotaxic center inhibits inspiration. All right, DRG causes normal inspiration. Normal expiration is more or less elastic recoil, and same with the VRG, it causes forced breathing. It is not involved in restful breathing. We have a few other points to discuss. What do you think will happen if the pneumotaxic center is removed or if the pneumotaxic center is damaged? So in a person whose pneumotaxic center has a dysfunction, which means it is not functioning as well as it should, in that case, the person will have difficulty in ending of inspiration. That will result in increased activity of DRG, which means the DRG will create inspirations and there will be nothing to check that inspiration, and therefore the person will have deep breathing. And the deep breathing episodes will obviously be involving slow breathing rates. So when there is no pneumotaxic center, the person will have deep breathing, and deep prolonged inhalations and exhalation will actually result in more stretching of the lungs, and it will also result in what we call as slow breathing rate or bradyapnea. So pneumotaxic center dysfunction is associated with bradyapnea. All right, and hyperactivation of pneumotaxic center will cause hyperapnea or tachyapnea. Okay. So far we have seen about the respiratory centers. Altogether, we call them respiratory rhythm center. Let me give you a quick crash course. In the brainstem, pons have one respiratory group, which is the pontine respiratory group. Whereas in the medulla, there are two respiratory groups, which are the ventral and the dorsal respiratory group. Because this is the ventral part, this is the dorsal part, so we have named them quite appropriately as VRG and DRG. DRG is the king because it is the one which is regulating the normal inhalation, or in other words, it is generating signals which correspond to normal inhalation. That being said, DRG is involved in quiet and restful breathing, which we do inadvertently. And then if we talk about VRG, the VRG is involved and activated only in the events of forced breathing, okay, not in the events of restful breathing. And VRG signals have to arrive through DRG only. DRG is promoted by apneustic center and DRG is inhibited by pneumotaxic center. Pneumotaxic center actually closes inspiration, to which the DRG has started or initiated, right? Now we'll see the signals which the receptors will supply to the respiratory center, and then respiratory center will make certain judgments and send fire impulses to nerves which correspond to these muscles. Okay. So first of all, remember the activity or the status of the respiratory center can be through various mechanisms, can be influenced. The first way it is to be influenced is through the central chemoreceptor. Okay, so there are certain receptors which are present in medulla, and these receptors are very ventral, more ventral to the VRG even. So in these areas, we have what we call as central chemoreceptors. We have what we call as central chemoreceptors. And these central chemoreceptors, they are sensitive to carbon dioxide partial pressures, and they are sensitive to proton concentration, which is a way of saying that they are sensitive to hydrogen ion concentration, or you can also say that they are sensitive to pH, because pH is nothing but a measure of hydrogen ion concentration. So central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla, and they are sensitive to carbon dioxide and proton concentration. And in case the CO2 partial pressure or the pH decreases, or the partial pressure of CO2 increases, in that event, they will cause increased respiration rhythm, so that the excess CO2 in the body can be eliminated. So this is the central chemo. Why do we call them central chemoreceptor? Because they are located in the medulla, which is basically the central nervous system. Then we also have another class of receptors which send input signals to these elements of the respiratory rhythm center, and that altogether are called the peripheral chemoreceptors. The peripheral chemoreceptors. These peripheral chemoreceptors, they are actually present in two specific regions. The one which is present in the aortic arc is what we call as the aortic body. Okay, so this aortic body is present in aortic arc, and the one which is present at the bifurcation of carotid artery into external and internal carotid artery, that is called as the carotid body. Okay, so in the aortic arc, we have a peripheral chemoreceptor called aortic body, and in the carotid artery, we have a at the bifurcation of carotid artery, we have the carotid body. And these are peripheral chemoreceptors, and they are sensitive to chemicals. In fact, these are sensitive to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and proton concentration, pH. So you can see one difference is that peripheral chemoreceptors are also sensitive to oxygen partial pressures, whereas central chemoreceptors are insensitive to oxygen partial pressures. This is how it works. So peripheral chemoreceptors are located in aortic arch, and they're also located in carotid body. And then through nerves, they supply to the medullary respiratory groups, DRG and VRG. The aortic arch is actually following the vagus path, which means the nerve path which the aortic body takes is the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. All right. So vagus nerve or the 10th cranial nerve basically causes the afferent signal to reach the respiratory rhythm center from the aortic body. Whereas for the carotid body, the signal actually travels through cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve. All right. So peripheral chemoreceptors are aortic body and carotid body. They are located at their obvious locations, and then carotid body through via glossopharyngeal nerve and aortic body through vagus nerve actually supply to the DRG and VRG respectively. And then we also have another class of receptors which influence breathing, and they are called as mechanoreceptors. They are called as mechanoreceptors. A subgroup of mechanoreceptors which are specifically for measuring pressure, they are called as baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are a subgroup of mechanoreceptors. Okay. So some baroreceptors are located in the nose. Let's say a person has inhaled certain pollen, and the receptors in the nose, the mechanoreceptor in the nose are actually allergic to that pollen, and that will cause increased rate of breathing. And those mechanoreceptors which measure the high pressure in the nose will also influence the centers for the regulation of breathing. But these, the ones which are located in the nose, the mechanoreceptors, actually involve the trigeminal nerve. So they involve the fifth cranial nerve or the trigeminal nerve. All right. Then we have two more mechanoreceptors which are located in one in the lungs and one in the GI tract. So the one which is located in the lungs, one good example of that is the stretch receptor. The stretch receptors of the lung. So if a person's lung is too full, which means too stretched, it will cause signals to travel to the DRG and it will make sure that the signal at the DRG, inhalation signal at the DRG, is inhibited, right? Then there are also signals in the GI tract, and this is more important for neonates and young children, because the ones in the GI tract will actually measure distension of stomach. So if the stomach is too full, if the stomach is distended due to food intake maybe, then in that case it will also send signal to the dorsal and the ventral respiratory groups to control the rate of respiration. Because with a distended stomach, it is very accidental to have high rates of breathing, because distended stomach can also mechanically pressure wise interfere with breathing, right? And these two receptors, the stretch receptors and the distension receptors, or the GI tract receptors, they travel to the medullary groups through the vagus nerve. So this is the same path as the path taken by the aortic body, right? So we are trying to make sure to have an analysis of the input signals which the respiratory centers receive. And so far we have seen that the respiratory center receives signals from the central chemoreceptors, which measure carbon dioxide partial pressures and proton concentration, and they very closely associate with the medullary groups. And then we have seen the second class, which are peripheral chemoreceptors. We call them peripheral chemoreceptors because they are located outside the central nervous system. So we call them peripheral chemoreceptors. They include aortic and carotid bodies, which take their specific routes and they are located at specific locations. But they also are influenced by oxygen partial pressures besides the partial pressure of CO2 and protons. Next, we have the mechanoreceptor or pressure receptors, baroreceptors, which are located in lungs. They can be or may be influenced by chemicals too. So, nose specifically supply efferent signals to trigeminal nerve or the fifth cranial nerve, whereas the lungs and the GI tract, which have stretch receptors or may also respond to particles like smoke in the lungs. So these are basically going to send afferent signals involving the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve, right? Next, we can also talk about certain neurological phenomenon which affect breathing. Like one neurological phenomenon can be, let us say, hypothalamic phenomenon involving anxiety, fear, or pain. So we do have hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is also the center for certain neurological phenomena like anxiety or in the state of pain or in the state of fear. So if a person is in the state of fear or anxiety or pain, it can also, the hypothalamic tract can also send neurological signals to respiratory groups, which can then on influence the rate of respiration. Remember, we also do have certain situations in which we have to control our breathing. Like, for example, we have to control our breathing during speech articulation. We also have to control our breathing during vocational things like singing and yelling or speaking loudly. We have to control our breathing sometimes during deglutition or swallowing. So sometimes we also have to control our breathing due to speech articulation. We also have to control our breathing during shouting or yelling. And we obviously also have to control our breathing during singing. And these are high order cognitive functions which require cerebrum to function. So one group of system which influence the respiratory rhythm center can be the cerebrum. So cerebrum also sends signals to the respiratory center to control the rate of respiration, because during speech articulation, yelling and singing, these kinds of activities also require us to have a direct control, or let us say the voluntary control over our breathing. So the voluntary regulation is through cerebrum, and cerebrum cannot directly control the intercostal muscle or the diaphragm muscle or the accessory muscle. It does so by coordinating with the respiratory centers in the brainstem, and then the brainstem actually sends and fires impulses to those muscles which are involved in ventilation. Now we can also, so far we have seen everything which is related to inputs which is received by the respiratory center. And if I were to summarize it for you once and for all, I hope you can see here that we have covered a lot of ground with respect to the respiratory center. We have seen the respiratory center is located in the brainstem, the pontine respiratory group, the dorsal and the ventral respiratory group of the medulla. They supply to their corresponding muscle groups. These muscle groups are directly involved in ventilation, and these are influenced by these respiratory centers, or respiratory groups are influenced by central chemoreceptors, peripheral chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and hypothalamic system, and the voluntary control involving cerebrum. These are, remember, the voluntary controls or the cognitive functions. Then we can talk about so far we have seen all these tracts and all these neurons and all these pathways, they are basically sending input signals. What about the output signal? How does the respiratory center basically sends which nerves specifically it uses to coordinate with the muscles? So we will take it one by one. Remember, the muscles which are involved in regulation of ventilation, they are mostly intercostals, they are mostly abdominal, diaphragm, as well as certain accessory muscles of the upper chest. So the respiratory center obviously utilizes spinal nerves and certain subgroups of spinal nerves which are activated for a specific muscle group. I think I should name them. So we can basically see the spectrum of spinal nerves, and the spinal nerve, first cervical to third cervical, the third cervical spinal nerve, they are involved in accessory muscles, which means they activate and innervate accessory muscles. And remember, accessory muscles usually are not involved in restful breathing. They are involved and stimulated only during forced breathing. Okay. Next, the C3 to C5 spinal nerve. This is the one which is actually going to supply to the diaphragm. Okay. So the C3 to C5 is actually going to supply to diaphragm, and diaphragm, as we know it, is involved in restful breathing. If we come down under, so we have the first thoracic nerve to the 11th thoracic nerve. These thoracic nerves are involved in supplying to the intercostal muscles. So we have lots and lots of intercostal muscles, and those different intercostal muscles have to be in a coordinated manner activated by these spinal nerves, the first to the 11th spinal nerve, and they are going to supply to intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles. And finally, from the 6th thoracic nerve to the first lumbar spinal nerve, they are going to supply to abdominal muscles. And usually abdominal muscles are only engaged during forced breathing. So abdominal muscles. So if I were to say that which two subgroup of muscles are actually involved during restful breathing, so they are obviously diaphragm and intercostals. And this segment of nerves are usually always involved in housekeeping breathing, whereas these are the ones which are involved only during forced breathing or impulsive breathing. So the respiratory center receives information from all these neurological tracts, all these hypothalamic tracts, and all these receptors, and eventually lays out and fires signals through these nerves to these muscles and basically regulate breathing pattern, as well as the rate of respiration, as well as the pattern of breathing and depth of breathing. So today we have seen more or less about the functional aspect, the structural aspect of regulation of neuronal regulation of breathing. I hope this lecture was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you in the next video.